I remember very clearly teaching Sierra to read. And Jay would come home from work and I would be, I'm meeting at the front door and I'm like, Sierra, show your dad what we did today. And I've taught her how to read the word am, so we're sounding out the word am. And I told Jay, I said, I really feel like somewhere along the line, we got lied to. And it's amazing to me. I went to one of the most prestigious, private Christian schools in the Portland area and came out as an honor roll student, involved in student government, all kinds of things. And yet I didn't feel equipped to teach a 5-year-old to read. And when we discovered, oh no, we can teach our own kids, it was life-changing. The best decision we ever made was to bring them home and educate them at home. It's been a remarkable journey.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another episode of Homeschool Talks, where I get to talk to interesting people in homeschooling world. And today I'm talking to a very interesting person, Heidi St. who is a prominent author, speaker, homeschool mom, mother of 7 children, wife of Jay, and I had to scratch out 4 grandchildren because she told me in the green room that there's number 5 just arrived. And Heidi is also serves as a member of the HSLDA board. We wanted to talk to her today about all of the exciting developments that she's been seeing in homeschooling world over the last several years. So welcome, Heidi.
Hey, it's good to see you. Thanks for having me.
So Heidi, before we get going, I'm sure most people in homeschooling world have seen you or speak at a conference or listen to your podcast. But for those who haven't, tell us your background. How did you come to homeschooling? And then how did you become, Heidi St.
Well, I sort of fell into homeschooling. I went, if people have, heard me out on the road, then they know I sort of went kicking and screaming into homeschooling. I never wanted to homeschool our kids. I could not conceive of why a woman in her right mind would stay home for 18 years in a row with her kids when a yellow bus would come take them away for free and she could get a shower in relative peace. It just didn't make any sense to me until our daughter was in the 2nd grade in a public school. And I noticed some changes happening in our family that I didn't love. And I noticed that most of, the best hours of our daughter Savannah's day, she's now a 33-year-old, mother of 4. She's got baby number 5 on the way here next year. But I noticed that this was having a detrimental effect on the sibling relationships, that the best hours of our day were really given to the school system. And I went to take Sierra down to the public school because that's all I knew, to enroll my 2nd daughter. She missed the cutoff by a couple of weeks. So I made the fateful mistake, Jim, of going to a local homeschool supply store because I had this, really inquisitive, bright daughter. She just had a little boy on Sunday. And they gave me a book called Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. It's like the gateway drug to homeschooling. Just no one ever told me. And I started to teach her to read. And it was like for the next, 6 months, all these just light bulbs were coming on. And I really loved my time with her. And before you knew it, I was plastering, pictures of the presidents, to be fair, only my favorite presidents, but up around the wall of our little dining room. And
you mean both of them?
Yeah, both of them. One of them would have been Ronald Reagan. Anyway, so the homeschool bug really bit me. And at the end of the school year, I pulled Savannah out of the public school. And the rest of our story in homeschooling is kind of history. I got into speaking also by accident. I love how the Lord does things, right? Jay and I were the president of the Washington Association of Teaching Christian Homes kind of a long time ago, the state organization here in Washington State where we live. we had a speaker coming for lunch for a women's luncheon, and she got sick and couldn't show up. And my friend Diana Waring was like, "You should fill in." And I was like, "Oh, no, no, no. I am the name tag girl. I'm not speaking." And she said, "I think you should try it." And my husband was like, "Heidi, you lead the women's Bible study. You'll be great at it." And so I just knees knocking, shaking with a little, couple of index cards, went up and gave a little talk. And before you knew it, I was being asked to speak in Idaho and then Arizona and then Montana. And sort of the rest is history. I signed a 7-book deal with Tyndale 8 years ago and working my way through that. I'm almost done. Started working with Brave Books recently. My first book with Brave came out in January. So and 6 of our 7 have graduated now. So I've got one left at home and she's in high school this year. So life's moving by at a pretty fast clip.
So I've heard on the homeschool drum circuit, that you are really looking forward to teaching Sailor algebra.
Yes, well, anyone who knows me knows my love of mathematics. No, Sailor has a fantastic tutor who has saved my sanity and probably my relationship with my youngest daughter. I feel like, Jim, like I could be 187 years old in homeschooling. Like I have this little rubric that I use to sort of calculate homeschool years. Like you can calculate dog years. I feel like we should be able to do that for homeschool moms, like calculate how old you actually are. And I think I'm 187. I think that's right.
So that may, cast a pall on some people's view of what homeschooling does to a homeschooling mom. But I also know you to be a very joyful, both homeschool mom and homeschool advocate.
Yes.
So, and your experience is not unlike my own in the sense that I came into homeschooling because my wife told me to, basically. And I lived in your neck of the woods back then. I don't know if you were around long enough ago to remember. What really sold me on homeschooling was similar to yours, and that was when she signed us up for a 3-day seminar called The Writing Road to Reading.
Mm-hmm.
And
yep.
I took time off from work, went up to Portland from Corvallis, and attended the Writing Road to Reading. And it was just a lot of fun. And our oldest was like 4 years old at the time. And we started working on teaching him how to read. And you mentioned light bulbs. This is something that you can't really transmit to people in words. But when you are present and kind of the proximate cause of a child's light bulb moments in the learning process, it's just irreplaceable.
Oh, yeah. There's nothing like it. And I remember very clearly teaching Sierra to read. And Jay would come home from work and I would be, I'm meeting at the front door and I'm like, "Sierra, show your dad what we did today." And I've taught her how to read the word am, so we're sounding out the word am. And I told Jay, I said, I really feel like somewhere along the line, we got lied to. Like we believed that only, quote unquote, certified teachers could teach their children to read or could you, and it's amazing to me. I went to one of the most prestigious, private Christian schools in the Portland area and came out as an honor roll student, involved in student government, all kinds of things. And yet I didn't feel equipped to teach a 5-year-old to read. And that's because the narrative in the culture is that the schools do the teaching. And I believed it. And that was sort of my life, I think, like many people my age. And when we discovered, oh no, we can teach our own kids, it was life-changing. It's been the very best decision. I mean, apart from introducing our children to Jesus, the best decision we ever made was to bring them home and educate them at home. It's been a remarkable journey. We're almost done.
Yeah. So as you started out as kind of an accidental homeschooler and discovered you loved it, and you had 7 children. How was the experience of raising 7 children from an early age, all of them being homeschooled? I mean, that's a question that a lot of people ask. How can you teach more than one kid? How does that even work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's multi-level teaching, right? And one of the workshops. I don't teach it so much anymore because I have focused a lot more on the ideology of parent-led, parent-directed education. But I used to teach multi-level teaching quite a bit out on the road. And one of the things I would always tell parents is I learned sort of the hard way. I was a first-generation homeschooler. I had no foundation, really no paradigm for home education. It was very new to me. And so a lot of the stuff I just learned by feeling my way around and kind of by goofing up and going, well, hey, that didn't work. I told my husband, I said, one of these days I'm going to write a book. I think I'm on my 11th or 12th book right now. One of these days I'm going to write a book called, well, that didn't work. Because I think that's how we learn a lot, right? We learn through trial and error. And eventually I learned that the very best way to teach a room full of different ages of kids was to focus on subjects that they could learn together. So history is a great example. We read to our children, and I would teach to the oldest child. So whether it was a science book that we were working our way through or history, I love, as you well know, I love this country. I love the history of our nation. And we did a lot of American history. And because I ended up speaking for a living, we took our kids to the East Coast several times. We've done, Monticello and Mount Vernon and all the amazing things that there are to see in Washington, D.C. and Virginia. Out where I live, we got like Pocahontas, and, Lewis and Clark. And the East Coast is so much more fun and rich in history. And we started really just teaching to the oldest child, and the younger ones would come along. And then by the time they were old enough to do the work that the oldest children were doing, they already had a foundation for what they were going to be taught. And so I think that's a really important concept. I think that our children, the younger ones especially, they really do learn just by sitting in a room with you while you're reading. We did a lot of reading. Every day I was reading for hours with the kids. And I learned sort of this kind of a school, but I would call it a school bus method for education. I would, reading to an oldest child. And when I see that the 6 or 7-year-old is kind of bored, I let him off the bus, and I might say, hey, here's a coloring book or a coloring page for you. And it might be, a picture of, cartoonish picture of George Washington or whatever. And I'm going to keep reading and they're going to be coloring. So they don't need to engage necessarily with me at that point, but they're still in the room. And they're still kind of benefiting from what's happening with their older siblings. And that was really how we did. There's just a few subjects that really have to be done individually, math obviously being one of them, and reading, one of those things. But I tended to do a lot of one room schoolhouse things with our kids. And looking back over the 25 plus years that we have done that, my kids would tell you, which I think is so interesting because most of my kids are in their 20s and 30s now. My kids would say that their best memories are of us reading together. The missionary stories that we read, the biographies. I'm an avid reader. Obviously, I love to read and hence, after that became an author myself. But I think that translated to the kids and they have a love of learning. Our kids are entrepreneurs. They're homeschool parents themselves now. And it's just fun to see that love of learning get passed on to the next generation.
So along the way, having 7 children kind of rising up into your homeschool and, circling together around an interesting book, how did that affect your relationship with your kids and their relationships with each other?
Oh, man. I think this is true across the board in homeschooling, Jim. I would bet it'd be true of your family too. I think that it created bonds that our children have that are very strong. The St. John family is a bit of a force. We all live in about the same area. And in fact, Jay and I just sold our house in Battleground, Washington, and moved closer to all of our kids and grandkids in Camas. So now, all 7 of our kids are within, 15 minutes of each other, which we love. And I attribute that to the time that we spent together when they were kids. Whatever we were doing as a general rule, we did it together. If the kids were participating in sports, we did it together. That is how we learned that the St. John's are not good at sports. That's how we learned that we're musicians. Was by, I remember one time in particular, one of my children who shall not be named was in we did a kind of a sports league, and this child was actually running down to the basketball court, scored for the opposite team. And my husband and I are up in the bleachers like, we should find something else to do. We should do something different. And so we ended up, doing a lot. Of course, my husband's a very gifted guitar player. We ended up doing a lot of music with our family, but the memories that we have. And then of course, I was speaking a lot. Jay and I started homeschool cooperatives, which turn into a giant nonprofit organization. And so we took our kids with us. So if we were out, if I was speaking, on the road, which I did a lot and still do quite a bit, we took them with us. And it was the best of times, Jim, and it was the worst of times. And but on the whole, we look back and I would say that it's one of the reasons why our family is so close. We just did everything together. And as much as I love traveling and speaking, it is just a delight to me. And in fact, I'm going to be in North Carolina here in just a couple of weeks. I I would say that my very favorite place to be still is home. It's sitting around the campfire with our kids and grandkids at the end of a long day, and people, bringing whatever leftovers they have in their fridge and hanging out. And I think that those things don't happen by accident. They happen because of intentionality, and we really just loved spending time with our kids. It breaks the narrative of the culture, right? That your kids are this interference and can't wait to send them to school and all the things. And uh, homeschooling really changed the way we saw family, and I think it did it for the better.
So along the way, you became an accidental speaker, and then a pretty. You speak a lot all over the country.
Yeah.
But you became kind of a homeschool planter as well, a movement leader. Talk to folks about that.
Again, I hate to just keep saying this, but so much of my life is an accident. We moved. My husband and I moved from the kind of Salem area in Oregon up to northern Washington, where he was on a pastoral staff at a church in Mount Vernon, Washington. And I was relatively new homeschooler at the time. And Jim, I was really lonely. I didn't know very many people that homeschooled, and we're at this new church in a new community. And normally I would have plugged myself into a school, right, and gotten to know the teachers and that kind of thing, and probably done some PTA work. But because we were homeschooling, it was a shift. Well, I heard about this idea of a homeschool cooperative, and I was scratching my head going, well, we should do that here. So at our church, we decided we would start a homeschool co-op. And so I went with, I think we had 3 kids at the time. I went with, our 3 kids, and we walked, every Starbucks, every grocery store, we put up little posters. We did it the old fashioned way, right? We're going to have a meeting. And if you're interested in a homeschool cooperative, here's the date and time. And Jim, I thought maybe like 15 people would show up to this meeting, and like 65, 70 people showed up. And I realized I wasn't the only one who needed community, that there was a real need for it. And that ministry started and grew very, very quickly to over several hundred families that were participating in this 1 day a week model of a homeschool co-op. When we got called to a different church in Southwest Washington, we did the same thing there. That grew really quickly. So we started another one in East County, and that grew. And then pretty soon we did one about 45 minutes to an hour north of us. And before we knew it, we were getting calls from all over the country. Could we do that here in East Tennessee? Can we do it in Maryland? And over the years, we ended up planting well over 100 homeschool cooperatives around the United States. And then eventually in 2016, when we saw things in the public schools really take a disastrous turn with Barack Obama's, edict saying that, the bathrooms are now going to be open to whatever gender the students identified at, what a ridiculous thing to say. And he said it out loud. And I looked at my husband and said, homeschool co-ops are not going to be enough. There's going to be an exodus. Never imagining what was going to happen. And who could have imagined COVID, right? So we began to pray about a full-time homeschool resource center. And it's a long story, but the short of it is an area businessman saw what we were doing and donated a building to us. And so we opened up, he rented it to us for $1 a year. So we rented this building, and we grew, exponentially. And then COVID hit, and our numbers there just exploded. And we began to look, that was so we opened in 2017. And this time last year, we were moving into the building where we are now. The Lord, in his miraculous provision, gave us another building. And so we paid, I think, $16.5 million in cash for the building that we're in now, closed on it free and clear. It was 100% donation driven. And so now we own this beautiful building. We had, I think, 1,300 students last year. We expect closer to 1,500 this year. We have over 230 classes here. I call it choose your own adventure homeschooling. Everything we do here is a la carte. And the idea is that well, I guess I should sort of give you the theology, I guess, of why we think this is so important. I think that this generation of homeschooling parents is very different from my generation and from your generation, Jim. I think, we were really running to something. When your wife said, hey, this is what I'd like to do, right? She was running to something. When I pulled Savannah out of the public school, I was really running to something. I saw a system of education that would be more life-giving for our children, that would give us time with our kids, that was academically superior to the public schools. This generation of parent is not really running to something. They're running from something. They're running from a public school system that is morally, academically, and spiritually bankrupt, and now is even injuring children. And I think if they're going to run from something, we need to give them something to run to. They don't have the same, I don't know if you want to call it chutzpah, that Heidi St. John had, when we made the decision to homeschool. I mean, you give Heidi St. John a little red wagon, I'm going to go to the library and figure it out, right? We are living in a very different world than we were 20 years ago. And the Homeschool Resource Center is really an answer to the changing tide that we see happening in the culture. And so what I want to do is be able to remove every obstacle from a homeschool family. So a mom might come here, happens actually, every day, people come here and they say, okay, we're crying uncle usually with the government schools, and we're going to give homeschooling a try. But our kid just loved being in the dance program that they had at Riverside Elementary School. And that's great. We have a dance program for you. If they say, well, our kids really love being in choir, great. We have a choir program. Or we've got now woodworking, moving into the trades, mechanics. We're teaching the Constitution here. And so you can sort of look at this menu of tutorials, and you might just come, one day a week for a couple of hours and participate in a couple of different classes. We don't allow students to attend here, quote unquote, full time. We are a traditional resource in the sense that we're here to sort of fill in the gaps for parents and give them a community. We have a bookstore here and a coffee shop, and we're always doing, we bring wonderful speakers here to train parents in homeschooling, sometimes in homeschool freedom. Jim, you should come out and give a talk here sometime. Just a really wonderful community. And we would like to see the model here replicated around the country. And so that's sort of the next thing we're working on.
So let me just, some people may not, I think you've touched on it, but the model of homeschooling that a lot of people have in mind is mom and the kids at the kitchen table with the books cracked and, starting at 9 o'clock in the morning and going to 3 o'clock. And that was never really we sort of started like that in our homeschool family,
Mm-hmm.
but then we sort of went into, getting associated with what we called cooperatives. And that might be one day a week where lots of kids get together and take certain classes together.
That parents are typically teaching.
Yeah. It's and so that served for a season. But what you have developed is kind of a next gen, maybe it's not a cooperative and it's not mom at the kitchen table, but it's also not a private school where you just drop off your kids and they get all the education they need. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. We actually don't allow for drop off here. And so parents stay, which is part of the reason why we have a coffee shop and a bookstore. We've got lots of different places for parents to hang out because they're going to kind of come and go throughout the week. And what we're trying to do here is just be the support to a parent who is running from something, who never said, I want to be the sole teacher for my children. These guys didn't have, they had not envisioned what I did originally and what we did for many, many years, which was, I was up and I was the teacher sitting around that table with our kids and sitting on the living room floor. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I look back at those years and cherish them and love them. But what we've done here is really create community and give parents more options than they've ever had before. So if someone says, hey, I need help with a transcript, I'm trying to figure out how do I write my daughter's high school transcript? Well, we've got people here who can help you do that. So it's every aspect of homeschooling from Washington State's requirement that children are tested once a year to can you help me with my daughter's transcript to I've got the cutest little 3-year-old you've ever seen in your life. And I heard you guys have a really cute ballet program. Well, yes, we do. And it gives them community. It gives them classes. We call them the 4 C's. It's community, it's classes, it's coffee, and it's Christ. And they get all of those things here at Friendly Planet. And we've actually had people move from different parts of the country to this area just to be involved in what we're doing.
How important is community in this day and age?
Oh, it can't be understated. I think it's less. I think it's less about 25 years ago it was more about this quote unquote socialization. Because I didn't want my in-laws or my parents to go, well, what about socialization? So then I could say, well, they're in a homeschool cooperative. Well, now I know that the whole socialization argument is a bit of a myth. And when people ask me about socialization, I always say, thank you so much for asking. That's exactly why I took my kids out of public school, right? Because I didn't want them socialized that way. But I think now the community of parents who maybe never thought that they would want to homeschool, just meeting other parents who are taking their kids out of the school system, the traditional government school system, and trying something new. You got to have that help. I think, homeschool moms need other moms that they can call when they're having a meltdown or a bad day and say, hey, I don't think I could do this anymore. And you're going to hear a voice on the other end of the phone who's going to say, oh, girl, you can. But today you need a mocha with extra whip, and I will be there in 15 minutes with it. Right. And that's what we're doing here is helping moms and dads make that connection, because it's not just the students who need the connection. It's their mom and dad too.
Back in the day, I was president of a local parent support group.
Yes.
Which was a thing a long time ago. And that was not for the benefit of the kids. I mean, the families got together as families, but it really was a recognition that moms and dads who undertake this adventure of homeschooling they need a community. They need support. They need other parents to be able to bounce ideas off of and to, I'm going to tell you a secret, Heidi.
Ooh.
So nobody else listen. Homeschooling can be hard.
What?
And so, support from like-minded people who can come alongside is really vital.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I do think, you got to have a reason, you got to know your why when you homeschool your kids, because when you have a bad day, and you will have bad days. I love to tell parents, listen, if you haven't had a bad day in homeschooling, you're doing it wrong, right? If it hasn't driven you to your knees yet, you're probably doing it wrong. Like, it does do that, but it also teaches you why it's so important that we do what we do. And if you can, part of what we're doing here is we're going to help. Anybody can start strong, right? It's hard to finish strong sometimes. And you want to be able to get to the end. I mean, I'm having a hard time finishing strong. There's, 20 years between my oldest and my youngest. And when my youngest went into high school, just a couple weeks ago, we kind of transitioned her from, just the sort of slower approach to schooling to be like, okay, now we're going to have to sort of buckle up and buckle down because you're in high school. And Jim, I'm kind of tired. I'm not going to lie. Like I've been teaching this now for 20 years. I'm in the vortex of, and we're going to do this again. And let's get out your easy grammar again. And let's write another paper again. But it's not old for her. It's new for her. It's just old for me. And I want to be able to finish strong. And I think that's part of why the community is so important, because you can have other people around you that will help you get to the end of your homeschool journey with joy and enthusiasm in the same way that you started.
So you were planting co-ops. Now that you have a resource center, what are you doing?
Well, for kind of the same thing. I think education, I think God wants to use it really as part of a spiritual revival of turning the hearts of fathers back to their kids and really shining a spotlight on the beautiful thing that is family. And so, the world says that children are a burden. God says children are a blessing. There's a different, we see things differently. I think, as Christian parents in the culture right now. And I would love to see homeschool resource centers in every city in America. And I know that if we could figure out a way to do that, and we're obviously still praying about it here, we're actually starting something. We're working with Christian Halls International here, and we're going to be offering dual enrollment and Oxford style tutorials. So college level classes here at Firmly Planted. I believe so strongly in this idea that our kids, those roots need to go deep, and kids were born into families for a reason and put in community for a reason. And so we want to strengthen that. And the Homeschool Resource Center is a way to do that. And if it could have the impact, say, in Johnson City, Tennessee, that it's having here in Vancouver, Washington, I think it has the potential to be landscape changing for the nation.
Hmm. And so you talked about people who, especially in the post-COVID world, maybe didn't have the same kind of vision for homeschooling as maybe earlier generations did. But I want to kind of quibble with you a little bit.
Quibble, let's do it.
I think, the early years, there were some people running away, perhaps. I think you're right. Most people in the early days were kind of more like my wife, and they dragged me kicking and screaming into this thing. But they had a vision they came kind of pre-installed with a vision. But something that I discovered, I know you're on the speaking circuit more than I am even. I went to a little tiny conference, and my assistant was saying, "Do you really want to go to this? It's not very big." And I said, "Well, if I don't have anything else that weekend and they want me, I'll go." And what I discovered, and you maybe see this too, is this was a tiny conference, and it had sort of died out because, kind of dying anyway because of COVID. It stamped it out. It was over once COVID hit. Mm-hmm. And part of that was the founders were done with homeschooling, and they kind of wanted to get on with life, and then COVID killed it. But their adult children, mm-hmm. who had been homeschooled their whole lives, revived it. And so I was there this year for the second year of the revival of this small conference. And it had grown like 50%, year over year. And it was the most delightful, most enthusiastic conference that I went to really this year. I mean, some of them were big, and, that's exciting. But this was a small conference of homeschool graduates who now had their own kids and were planning to homeschool them. And they caught the vision for leadership. And that was just super, super exciting. So that's a thing that didn't exist in the early years because there was no second generation or third generation of homeschooling families. So that's a second thing. And then COVID, obviously changed the world in many ways. And so then there's a whole population of people who maybe wouldn't have thought about homeschooling, but because of COVID, they did. And now they're looking for the resources to be able to continue homeschooling.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. And I wonder if, all of these sort of new, and you mentioned it at the top of the hour today, these pod schooling, and there's, we're really seeing ingenuity, which is what America has thrived on since its founding, right? Ingenuity. Let's come up with new ideas. How can we do this better? And I do think you mix this continuing ingenuity. The Homeschool Resource Center is, I think, a pretty good example of that, with the second and third generation wave of homeschoolers that are coming out onto the scene now. I'd put my kids in that. My oldest grandson is almost 12. And so we're watching our children really investing in the next generation, and they have ideas too. And so I think they're going to keep pushing the ball down the field. And I'm excited. I hope that, moms and dads who are, more my age and older, who've been kind of in this thing for a while, don't, sail off into the sunset. I hope they remain engaged, whether that's, working with local homeschool support groups, or whether it's helping with statewide conferences, which I think are very important, vital, even to the continued growth and success of home education, but also just to stay in there for the rising generation, to say, hey, I'm here to help. And that experience, which has been, hard earned, is a wealth of of knowledge for the next generation. So I hope people stay in it, and I think a lot of them will.
Yeah. So I failed to mention this at the top of my podcast, but we are doing a home and home podcast sharing today. We earlier did. I was interviewed as a guest on your podcast, which is called what?
Well, it's just called the Heidi St. podcast. It used to be called Off the Bench, but the branding department said we didn't need it. So now it's just Heidi St. It's boring, but it is what it is.
Well, but it's a very popular podcast for a lot of reasons. A lot of homeschoolers and others listen to it. So you used to call it Off the Bench.
Yep.
And now it's Heidi St. podcast. What kind of things do you do on your podcast besides interviewing, boring old,
Well, first of all, my interview with you wasn't boring. I don't interview boring people. I believe very strongly that Christians should be involved in every sphere of influence, and lots of things are interesting to me. Obviously, homeschooling is interesting to me. Jay and I are going to celebrate our 35th anniversary in September this year. I speak a lot about marriage and family. I ran for Congress a couple of years ago. Politics is really interesting to me and really important. Politics determines policy. Policy shapes the nation. I think these are conversations that we should be having. And so I had Kirk Cameron on my show a couple of days ago talking about the See You at the Library movement, where we see, people showing up to read actual good books to children at libraries. I did a lot of conversations in the middle of COVID about freedom. I've had lots of politicians on my show talking about the, liberty issues. I am a huge fan of the homeschool movement, obviously, but also of secondary education that's actually truly honoring to the Lord. So there's not a lot that we don't cover there. I just had a great conversation with my friend, Pastor Phil Hopper from Abundant Life Church in Kansas City, Missouri. And he was answering a listener question, and she had said, listen, she wants to have more children, but her husband doesn't want to. How should she respond? And he had a great answer for that. So we do all kinds of topics there, and it seems to be resonating. We're coming up on 25 million downloads at the show. It airs 3 days a week. It's heard wherever podcasts are available, and it's streaming on the Real Life Network with Pastor Jack Hibbs now. So lots of really fun, good things happening. It's one of my favorite things to do is do that podcast. So thanks for asking.
You betcha. And it was a pleasure for me to be included in such an august body of guests. I mean, I'm sorry for sort of lowering the standards a bit there.
You didn't lower the standard because you brought it. You brought your A game. I thought it was great.
So you are a popular speaker in the homeschooling circuit and an author. If you were to pick one book that you've written that you would like to have recommended to my listeners, and keeping in mind that this is mostly homeschoolers, what would you recommend?
Well, the first book I ever wrote was called The Busy Homeschool Mom's Guide to Romance. And people can get that just about anywhere. It kind of for a long time. I mean, I'd say for probably a good 5 years on the circuit, I got tapped as sort of the Dr. Ruth of homeschooling. And I love talking about marriage. I come from a broken home, and the Lord has really done just a tremendous work in my life and in the life of my husband. And I think people will really resonate with that. That book is kind of what launched my writing career. Dr. Dobson got a hold of it and called me and invited me on his show. It's how I became friends with Dr. Dobson. It's a very honest look at the stresses that homeschooling can put on a marriage, and why I strongly believe that marriage is more important even than home education. I tell moms, do not sacrifice your marriage on the altar of homeschooling, because one of these days you're going to be done with homeschooling and you're still, by the grace of God, going to be married to that man. So I think people will laugh, they'll cry. It's a great book that you can read out loud with your spouse. And it's, probably one of my favorite books that I've ever written, right next to Becoming Mom Strong, How to Fight with All That's in You for Your Family and Your Faith. That was my first book from Tyndale. So those two are probably my favorites.
Well, Heidi, I'm going to give you the last word today. You've been generous with your time, especially since we're doing the dual podcast thing. It's the marathon podcast. What what's your last word of wisdom for a homeschool mom or dad?
Oh, I just think, we're getting ready to start a new year, right? Going into a brand new year of homeschooling. And I like to see people get it off on the right foot by just honoring God's priorities. I don't think that God ever intended for homeschooling to run you over and leave you on the side of the road for dead. And so just starting off and give it all to the Lord, even the things that you think he doesn't care about, the science lessons and your curriculum plans and the scope and sequence and your schedule and all of it. Give it to the Lord. My husband and I love to go out to dinner at the beginning of every year and kind of talk through our plans. It's been one of the best things we've done over, 27 years of homeschooling. And I think the Lord honors it. So love your people well. Long after you close the last page of that math book and you're done teaching U.S. history and your kids know the Constitution frontwards and backwards, long after that is over, by the grace of God, you're still going to have relationships with those adult kids. And so love them well and enjoy the time God gives you.
Yeah, you never stop being their mom or dad.
That's right.
So, ladies and gentlemen, my guest today has been Heidi St. John. And we can find out more about her at her website at heidistjohn.net. And you can find her podcast wherever podcasts are found. And I assume your books are available on the usual book places as well. And this has been another episode of Homeschool Talks with me, Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, with my very delightful guest, Heidi St. John. So thanks, Heidi.
Thank you, Jim. It's been a lot of fun.
And if you want to know more about HSLDA, you can find out about us at hslda.org, where you can join and add your membership to the cause for homeschool freedom, because that's what we're all about here, is being advocates for homeschool freedom. And we'd love to have you as part of our team to stand for freedom all across the country. So thanks again for listening.
Today's episode is made possible by HSLDA's Generation Joshua program. Do you have a student who wants to make a difference in our nation? Generation Joshua empowers teens to make the most of their citizenship through local clubs, immersive simulations, online courses, and real-life campaign experiences. For more information, visit generationjoshua.org. That's generationjoshua.org. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.